It's great to have you all here as we have our closing weekend for Chicago Calling's run in Chicago before the exhibit gets packed up, and we say au revoir as it goes to Paris, then Heidelberg, Lausanne, wrapping up in Amsterdam in 2020. So very exciting that Intuit is taking this exhibit. I think we have some lenders in the house to the exhibition. Thank you so much for being part of Chicago Calling, one of the most significant exhibits we've ever done. So welcome, and with that I think, let's see, any other special announcements? Just a couple. On Thursdays we're doing Art After Work. You're all invited in the month of February. We're going to be at Revolution Brewing up on Kedzie. So not the location in Logan Square, but their other location. And then on the third Thursday of March, the two artists that are featured in the exhibit next door are going to be joining us to make art. So please come hang out, have some adult beverages. Don't worry if you don't feel like you're good at drawing. We've got lots of other activities for you, so we'd love to see you at one of those after-work events, and they're free. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Smith, our Senior Manager for Education and Experience.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Deb mentioned, and I'll reiterate, as we celebrate the run of Chicago Calling, Art Against the Flow, we are grateful to all of you who have reached out with interest in telling your personal experiences and memorable encounters with these individuals. I have the honor of introducing each of our speakers this evening. Before we get started, I will mention a few brief programming notes. If you've not already done so, please silence your cell phones. I ask that because, as a reminder, if you're not aware, this program is being video recorded this evening. We'd like to acknowledge our partner, Free Spirit Media, and our videographer, Sam, who's with us tonight documenting this event. We're grateful to be able to capture this to share in perpetuity. If you need to exit the audience seating while the program is running, we ask if you could please exit to the outer aisles just because of the filming taking place to remain good sight lines for the speakers. We do want you to note that the stories will continue this evening in succession. Speakers will be called up by name to share their story. There will not be time in between stories for questions or responses, but we definitely will have time afterwards and encourage everyone to have a dialogue and share one-to-one or ask those questions that you won't have a chance to do right away in the program. We will be here afterwards. And some of you who didn't finish your beverages, you can finish those afterwards too. Lastly, some speakers have brought in visuals this evening to pass around in tandem with their stories. So we will be passing those, distributing those amongst the aisles. So please review those and keep those moving so that everyone can see the visuals that are referenced tonight when certain speakers are talking about their images. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome our first storyteller up to the podium. Lisa Stone is the co-curator of Chicago Calling Art Against the Flow. Lisa will share her personal story about Dr. Charles Smith tonight, and she will also share a story about Lee Godie on behalf of Kenneth Burkhart, co-curator of Chicago Calling Art Against the Flow. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Stone.
And thanks to everyone, and special thanks and appreciation to all the lenders to the exhibition. Obviously, we couldn't do this without you. I love this show. And thanks to Intuit staff for organizing this. And I'm going to stay within the time limit, so I won't go on and on and on. But first, I'm going to read Ken Burkhart, my co-curator. If he had not agreed to do this show with me, I wouldn't have done it. So let's all have an applause for Ken. And he sent me some reminiscences about Lee Godie. So I'll try to do it in something approximating his voice. Within a week of having moved to Chicago in 1976, One of my fellow students at Midway Studios asked if I had seen Lee Godie on the steps of the Art Institute yet. I had not at this point, but my radar went into full alert from his animated description of her presence and his warning to not try to take her picture. That's a death wish, that was. Not long afterward, I began to see Lee along Michigan Avenue at either of the steps of the Art Institute or nearly as often in or near the Cultural Center. On several attempts to engage Lee, I was pretty much rebuked, later learning it was most likely my sport coat and tie that may have put her off. Finally, around 1984, on a warm spring day, as I was headed to eat my lunch by the Bertoia sculpture at the foot of the Standard Oil building, there was Lee, lying flat on her back on top of the marble wall that led to the reflecting pool and sculpture. Her eyes were closed. Her white, but not so white by then, faux fur coat pulled open, sunning her face and chest, not unlike the sun worshippers I had encountered in the parks of Paris. Good point, Ken. Next to her, leaning against the marble wall, was a large, worn black portfolio case with a roll of works protruding. I approached her and asked if she had any art for sale today, and without opening her eyes, she sat up and said, yes, just one. She pulled the roll of works from her nest and very selectively extracted a remarkable window shade painting of the Prince of Chicago, featuring a male portrait at the top and a male portrait at the bottom with a flowing river of leaves that swooped down and around each head, modulating from green at the top to fall colors at the bottom. 1984. It was very large, which worried me since I had about $30 in my budget to spend at the time, so when she said $60, I was crushed. Not one to negotiate with artists on the price of their works, I asked if she had anything for $30, since that was all I could afford at the moment. Nope. But she was convinced that I could afford this magnificent work. However, if not, she would be happy to cut it in half for $30. Yikes. Not a lot of French Impressionists, to my knowledge, ever did that. Other French Impressionists. I actually contemplated this situation and said if she would just wait there for me, I would get the $30 in return. As I hustled off, she called out, "Bring the scissors." I made a quick trip to the cash station and was relieved that it actually gave me $30. I was in the thick of a money pit gut job renovation of our home, and then slid by my office for a pair of scissors. Ken worked in the Cultural Center then. I was somewhat surprised to see Lee still sunning herself and clutching the rolled up painting. I pulled out the $30, she rolled out the painting, taking the scissors, began holding them at the edge, moving up and down all the time, saying, "How about here? And come on, you can afford $60, pointing out that the top was a hanging stick, a thin tree branch, for keeping the painting straight. We did this dance for about 6 or 7 times with me explaining there was no way I was going to have her cut the painting in half and would have to wait for a piece I could afford. Ken has always been an honorable man. Abruptly, she rolled the painting up, handed it with the scissors to me, and said, "You can owe me $30. I said, "Fair enough," but I had to write an IOU, so she fished out a Lipton tea bag from her overly deep cluttered pocket, pulled the wrapper off, and handed me to where I wrote, "I owe Lee Godie $30 for a painting." She took it, put it back in the same chaotic pocket. When my next paycheck came, I put $30 in the do not spend slot of my wallet, anticipating my next Lee encounter. 1 month went by, 2 months went by, 3 months went by, no Lee. I actually began to worry about her. Then one very typically cold Chicago winter day, I went in the Washington Street entry of the Cultural Center, and there, sitting on the marble bench, was Lee munching on a large bag of corn curls. She jumped a bit when I approached her, most likely assuming I was going to oust her or let her know that she couldn't eat there. But when I reminded her that I owed her money for a painting I had bought some time ago, she took the cash, laid it down next to her, patted the bench for me to sit, and said, "How do you like it?" So I told her how much I loved it. She wanted to know where I hung it and would I like some corn curls, as she held out the somewhat dubious-looking bag. At the top of my stairs, I said, "And yes, I would love to share a bag of corn curls with Chicago's French Impressionist artists." Thank you, Ken. Ken lives in Ithaca, New York, and he likes it so much there, especially when there's about 20 feet of snow, so he didn't make it here tonight. So they're going to make me read my recollections second, so here I am being me, and this is a photograph of what I'm going to talk about. A few years ago, Dr. Charles Smith joined my art history class on the day I presented his work in a class about artist-built sites of conscience. Together, we showed slides and talked about his work for nearly 3 hours. During the Q&A, when everyone was mostly stunned, a student asked Dr. Charles Smith, "What is it that drives you to make so much art, to make art all the time, wherever you are," or something like that. In his commanding, powerful, true gospel spoken here voice, he described the hell of combat in Vietnam, where he served in the Marine Corps from 1966 to 1969. He described an exchange with Viet Cong soldiers who taunted him and other African American soldiers saying, "You're serving your country here, going through all this shit and putting your lives on the line, and when you go home, they're gonna lynch you." He reminded the class that when serving in the armed forces, it's your job to kill human beings that the US government doesn't like. Real human beings, after looking them in the eyes. His emotions were running high. He said he returned home after the war, a broken man. He explained that the only way he could deal with the never-ending pain of having killed innocent women and children and other human beings has been to make art all the time, to save himself, which is what he's been doing since 1986. Quite ironically, a student, a woman of color, confronted me later with much indignation and said she couldn't believe I would bring an African-American artist to class who boasted about killing people, who glorified war and made art about it. This happens when you teach. She totally didn't get it. But many students heard him. Countless people have heard him over his 32 years of making art, have experienced his work, allowed it to penetrate their emotional armor, and let themselves be moved and charged by his soulful project. So last night I called Dr. Smith, who was in high spirits, and poured gratitude on us for including him in Chicago Calling and for sending the works overseas. He then talked about his deep appreciation for my incredible and beloved co-curator, Ken Burkhardt, and about halfway into the soliloquy, he said that Ken embodies the Vietnam foxhole love of complete camaraderie, a compliment of the highest order. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Ken. Next, I am pleased to welcome Carla Winterbottom, who will be sharing personal memories of Wesley Willis. Carla will also be joined by Ricky Willis, who will share memories of his brother Wesley. Thank you, Carla and Ricky.
Thank you. First, I'm going to read a letter that Wesley received in 2003 when he was in hospice. Dear Wesley, my name is Abe Scott. I'm 18 and I live in Attleboro, Massachusetts. You are my personal hero. I cannot think of anyone who has the same strength and resilience that you have. You have been through so many bad situations and dealt with them with positivity and faith. Your commitment to working hard at your songwriting and artwork is a true wonder, and your honest love for rock and roll music is probably the most pure and sincere of anyone I've ever met. You are also a great, honest songwriter, an incredible artist, and a wonderful human being. I only had the chance to see you live once, despite being a fan for 5 or 6 years now. I saw you in Providence, Rhode Island at AS 200 in March 2002. It was one of the greatest shows I have ever attended, and meeting you was an honest-to-God thrill. You took about a half hour out of your day to talk to me, which I really appreciated. We talked about buses in Attleboro and Providence and bands we liked. I gave you a portrait I drew of you. You gave me a hug and many headbutts. We laughed and had a good time. You signed my copy of Greatest Hits Volume 2 to my friend Abe, which really meant a lot to me. I went home that night happier than I'd ever been following a rock show. I've had some dark times in my life in the past 2 years, and I always managed to remind myself not to sit around feeling sorry for myself and not to become a bitter asshole, because you've never done either of these things despite all the problems you have. You understand that life is beautiful and okay, and that there's a lot of places to find hope and happiness, and that being such a nice guy and productive person are both very important to being happy. I can honestly say that your approach to life has changed my life for the better. It had saddened me to find out you had leukemia. I really hope you make it through. You've made it through so many hell rides before. I'm sure you can make it through this one. My friends and I have prayed and continue to pray for you. If you're allowed to take phone calls, I'd like to wish you well on the phone. Your music and most of all, your approach to life has been a huge inspiration to me personally, and I really hope you're doing well. So many people love you, Wesley. Your fans, and you truly have a lot of friends and fans. You have a lot of both. Take care, buddy. Your friend and fan, Abe Scott. That letter was one of many he received, and I thought it just summed up everything about the personality and his impact on his fans, whether they were art collectors or rock stars and other rock musicians. Wesley had a way of turning a phrase to play with language and emotion that was unique and charismatic, which friends adored and fans wanted to get close to. He also had a strong sense of ethics and discipline, working daily, whether it was art, songwriting, recording, performing, selling, or networking. Once he called me from a trip to Green Bay to proudly tell me he was stopped by a cop, but he explained, "I'm an artist and a rock star. I'm a good citizen. I have diplomatic immunity." Typical Wes. With that, the charmed cop wished him a good day. Wesley enjoyed writing very politically charged songs about world leaders, and I think he would really relish this Trump era for its song potential. While I lived with him, a big part of his day was making phone calls. He had huge phone bills, which he was proud to pay, and on the phone he treated everyone equally. I couldn't tell if he was speaking to friends, other rock stars, CEO, art collectors from the Loop, etc., etc. A name I heard quite frequently was Rolfe Achilles, finally met. And it was interesting to find out who was who later on, but Wesley was no more impressed by one person than another, which I thought was pretty cool. On bad days, he could be swinging chairs in the streets or yelling at voices, but he would often check himself into the psych ward, later befriending doctors, selling them art, and writing tribute songs to them. A very atypical schizophrenic. Across from Genesis Art Supply, his headquarters, we were once at the counter at the Fullerton restaurant, and we had a decidedly old-fashioned looking waitress with a tight dyed bun and severe makeup, including thin ruby red lips. Wesley stared at his menu and started muttering, "The flaming lips, the flaming lips, the flaming lips." And I said, "Wesley, stop that." And he's like, "It's just a band," and then smiled at both of us with that win-over grin of joy. On his first plane trip, he walked straight to the first-class row and sat down and announced, "I'll just sit here." And then, "Are we gonna die?" Later on, I traveled on other planes with him, and I'd see people initially looking appalled, moving, and then curious. Some would recognize him, and then he would start the charm offensive, funny quips, handshakes. "I'm glad to know you." The sales, by the time he left the plane, he had money, phone numbers, new friends, and just a continuing sense of joy. In our big apartment in Pilsen one night, I heard him making noises across the way, and I said, "Hey." He answered, "Who hey?" We both started cracking up with kids and continued to make inane statements and noises just to entertain each other. It was many moments of this kind of childlike silliness and joyousness. When Wesley called to tell me of his leukemia diagnosis, he said, "You don't want this rock star to perish. You want a healthy Wesley, right?" Sometime later, he said, "If I die, it'll be in the news." Yes, it was. And he would love this, and it warms my heart to see his work and memory honored like this. Thank you.
Vicky, do you want to come up and say anything? Okay, Ricky Willis, everyone is going to talk to us for a moment.
This on the project work is 2012 downtown Chicago. August. I started a new art, a new job. Downtown. With downtown Chicago. And I started enjoying, we made water tanks and buses and buildings and cars and boats like that.
Ricky's art is kind of a 3D representation of Wesley's.
You sell it first and you get paid, that's it.
Can you hold up your eyepiece so everyone can see it?
This was back, Butterfly Music, way back. Before it passed away, 2003. He was born 1963, 2003. He started drawing in 1980. And before it died, 2003. In the hospital, he got sick and we came to him.
Ricky, so that's kind of like the bus rides we used to take, right? The joy rides?
Yes.
Which kind, on the pace?
In the pace bus called the Suburbs.
Suckers.
CTA bus in Chicago. The Metro train in Chicago. The Metro train in suburbs in Chicago. The Amtrak out of town.
Thank you, Ricky. And there's also 2 pieces of works by Ricky in the Intuit store. So if you'd like to see more of his work after the show, maybe Ricky, you can show everyone. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, and Project Onward, and you've got it on your shirt in case anyone wants to know where they can go and visit you, right? And while you're working. Yeah.
And also 629.
Yeah, the art show. Yeah.
4th floor, Project Upward.
Fourth floor. What's that? What's the address?
1200
1200 West 35th Street. All right. If you haven't been to Project Onward, you need to get there like yesterday.
You on 4th floor.
Yeah, 4th floor. All right. Thank you, Ricky. And thank you, Carla. Thank you for sharing your stories. Joining us next is Tom Palazzolo, who will share a story about Lee Godie.
Oh, yes, I'm not going to use this thing because I think it distorts, so I'm going to just talk and loud. First, I'd like to recommend 2 things. The hand warmers right across the street at Walgreens are cheap and they work all day. And the other thing I'd like to recommend, and maybe I shouldn't, is the margarita mix. Anyway, getting to the story before they take the hook and take me off. Captain Fleming and I are making a film on Lee Godie, and we've found some interesting stories. And one of those stories is that once Lee was evicted from her hotel, we think it was the Tokyo Hotel, which was right across the street from the Tree Studios. Now, some enterprising young artists, they also threw her work out. All her paintings were thrown out on the street. And Lee was left to wander around in the city. I think it was cold out, too. The artist who lived in the Tree Studio picked up the paintings and took them in. He then, through a friend, was able to, let me sober up for a minute and say that the police picked Lee up and took her to some facility. I think it may have been, I forgot the name of it. If we could call Kepler now, I could find out. No, we won't do that. So anyway, she was taken to a facility. She wouldn't tell anyone her name, but the doctor who came in to examine her knew right away it was Lee Godie. Godie. How do you pronounce? No, I should know by now. I've interviewed lots of people, and anyway, he said that is Lee Godie. And they also found out that the person who got the pictures, who picked the pictures off the street, had tracked Lee down, brought in a contract, and had Lee sign the contract saying that that she would give all those paintings to this person whose name I won't mention. But the doctor had pronounced Lee incompetent. So, and the doctor was horrified that this person was exploiting Lee's work and had got her to sign this contract. So he called the public guardian, who he knew well. Public guardian got on the case, was very angry about the situation, and the public guardian tracked down, well, they had the contract there, tracked down the guy who had the pictures and got them to return them. Actually, they were returned to the Carl Hammer Gallery, which was the gallery that it was representing Lee Godie at the time. So anyway, I guess that worked out good. 2 minutes? Hey, maybe I'll tell another quick one. And this is a very quick one. My friend Stanley, Stanley Garber, was a big fan of Lee Godie and went to her apartment, well, not apartment, the rental of place at the Tokyo Hotel. Went up to her apartment, which was roach infested. Boy, that's hard to say. Roach infested, and wanted to buy some of her work, which she sold to him. But then she said, I guess because then she said to him, "I'd like to paint your picture." And he said, "Fine, terrific." He sat down there. He said that by the sink was her little watercolor set, and roaches were eating all the colors. And but anyway, he sat down next to her. She started to paint him. She didn't like beards. Oh, I guess she did. There's some pictures of beards. And so she's painting him, and then she looks him in the eye 1 minute. Okay. She looks him straight in the eye and says, "You know, I can do a better job on this picture on the lips, if you kiss me." Stanley, being the gentleman that he is, he said, "Well, you see, I'm married, and it wouldn't be a good idea." So, but he got a really nice picture, and if we ever finish this film, you'll see his actual interview about that incident. All right, my drink is still in there. Thank you. What?
You forgot your hand warmer.
I didn't forget my hand.
Oh boy, it's getting crazy in here already. Tom, if people want to learn more about your film that's in progress, is there somewhere they can go? Do you have a website for the film?
What did you say?
The website? Do you have a website for the film you're working on?
I think we do, but I don't know what it is.
Ah, okay. Well, I was giving you a plug opportunity.
I'll give it to you.
Okay. Okay. Stay tuned, folks. Thank you, Tom. Next up to the podium, we will be hearing from Intuit staff member Annalie Wetzel, who will be sharing recollections about Pauline Simon as prepared by Pauline's granddaughter, Judy Messling. Annalie?
Hello. So, as Melissa
also mentioned, I'm reading on behalf of Judy Messling, who is the granddaughter of Pauline Simon, and these remarks were written by her mother, Pauline's daughter. Originally written on January 5th, 1991 by Pauline's daughter, Gwen Simon Besser, typed and edited by Judy Messling, Pauline's granddaughter, from the original manuscript. My mother, whose maiden name was Peshki Kletsky, was born and raised in a town called Nesvitz, which, according to Jim Besser, Pauline's grandson, is about 100 miles southwest of Minsk. I believe that this town was either in Tsarist Russia or in Poland at the time. It is my understanding that the border was fluid. Her father, who had red hair and blue eyes, was a kindly and gentle man who was very studious and pious. The family was extremely religious and orthodox. Papa taught in Cheder Hebrew school and spent most of the rest of his time praying in the synagogue. His mother was the businesswoman in the family, apparently, and supported the family by making wigs. I imagine that this was a relatively important occupation, as Orthodox women wore wigs all the time. She was also very artistic, and Pauline recalled seeing her mother copy the shapes of snowflakes on the window. She also had many children, perhaps more than 12, many of whom died in infancy. I have no idea what happened to the rest of the siblings except for Rosie, who lived with Pauline for her entire adult life, and 2 other sisters, and I believe the latter died after the revolution. My mother's memories of her childhood were mostly of the extreme superstition of her parents, the gentleness of her father, her bitterness over the poor life they led, and her constant longing for an education. At one point, she went to Warsaw and studied in a convent, but I can't imagine how she managed that. There, she learned fancy needlework, which she has hated for the rest of her life. As a young adult, back in her hometown, she became active in a play acting group and various other groups of young intelligentsia and revolutionaries. At one time, she was arrested for distributing revolutionary pamphlets. When she asked permission from her guard to go to the bathroom, he told her to do whatever she wanted, as he was going to escape soon, too. In later years, my mother told me that she really didn't understand the revolution intellectually, but all her friends were involved with it, and she wanted to believe in whatever the young intelligentsia believed in. Pauline wanted desperately to get a good education, and when an uncle told her that anybody could get an education in America, she was determined to come here. She wrote to a distant relative and prevailed upon him to send her a ticket. When she arrived in Chicago, her sponsor, who I gather was something of a wimp, brought my father with him to meet my mother. My father took over from him, found mother a place to stay, got her clothes and a job of sorts, and so their courtship began. My mother was nervous and high-strung, and when I was little, she was crazy clean. In later years, she told me once not to be extreme about cleanliness the way she had been. I told her there was absolutely no danger of that. I vividly remember her going on rampages, storming into my closet and throwing everything out of it because the closet was a mess. She was also a belly button watcher, constantly analyzing her own emotions, actions, and motivations. Is there a gene for such trait? It seems to be common among us. She could be enormously charming and made friends wherever she went, but again, like me, she was overly sensitive and easily hurt by people. Although my mother had never shown any artistic ability or interest in art, she took a class in drawing after my father died, more as therapy than anything else, as she was having difficulty coping with the loss of a very close companion. Her first class was in anatomy at the Art Institute of Chicago, where her granddaughter eventually received a BFA. She didn't do very well there. Then she began studying privately with Don Baum at the Hyde Park Art Center. Don was on the Illinois Art Council, the dean of the art department at Roosevelt University, a member of the Harry Who, a group of young avant-garde artists at the Hyde Park Art Center, and the head of the Hyde Park Art Center. He took an interest in her and encouraged her. Before long, she won second place in Mayor Daley's Senior Citizen Art Contest, and then Don Baum began to place her paintings in all the big galleries in Chicago, including the Phyllis Kind Gallery. To our great surprise, almost all of her paintings were sold. She received excellent reviews in the papers and articles written about her in several books. She loved being an artist and only regretted that she didn't start until she was 70 years old. Now we would like to welcome up Rolfe Achilles, who will be sharing a story about Wesley Willis. Rolfe?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see all of you here and to thank Ken and Lisa for putting this fabulous show together, which I think is a very important show for Chicago and hopefully in Europe. Wesley's well known in France, the Netherlands, Germany already. So to actually see the work and see his colleagues, I think will be a really important eye-opener in the different places that it's going to be showing. But I met Wesley in August of 1985. And I was at the time director of the Mies van der Rohe Centennial at IIT, and I met him through Wesley through T. Paul Young, he's now Paul Young, and then through Peter Beltamaki, who were both on the architecture faculty at the time. And I got some of the stories of how Wesley started drawing and learning perspective from Paul Young and from Peter Beltamaki. The wheels, for example, that you see on his trucks are Peter Beltamaki's showing Wesley how to do wheels. But more personal stories is that all the numbers that Wesley has on all of his drawings are real. He had a memory of every single number that he saw. And in the Mies van der Rohe office, where he would come every morning at 8:30, he was there just half hour before I was, and he would show up, and then all the architects and so forth from around the world that came into the office would sit and chat with this strange man who was sitting there drumming around on the desk and making general noise. But we didn't mind it. We kept him there and allowed him to proceed. And he was selling and hawking his works right there in the office. And people like Calatrava and other world-famous architects came in and bought a drawing and thought this was just the coolest thing. Myron Goldsmith bought a number of drawings. George Danforth was a great fan of Wesley's. And George and I bought him his first Yamaha piano. And we had it in the office and he would play on it. It was sort of a riotous thing, but at least he didn't beat the drum all the time on the table. So that was fun. And then Wesley started telling me about his troubles with having money. He would sell a drawing and put the money in his pocket, and then he would go downtown and get robbed. Happened fairly often. So I took Wesley to the bank, Citibank at the time, which was downtown, to the bank I went to, and talked to the manager to get him to open an account. They wouldn't let Wesley in the bank because he didn't look like a patron of the bank. They'd let me in, but not him. So he and I talked to the manager and said this would make a really interesting story for the Chicago Sun-Times. And I could call them right now. We can get somebody here, and you can explain why you won't open a bank account for this person. And they let him in. Wesley sat down and started drawing. He always drew. And so the security guard came over and said, "You can't draw." And Wesley said, "Huh?" And just kept on drawing. And the security guard said, "Well, you can't draw, you're in a bank. Just like you can't photograph." And the manager said, "You can't do this." And I said, "But he's drawing a building that's like 5 blocks away. It has nothing to do with your lobby. He's not going to draw you or anything." And so we got that all straightened out. Wesley opened a bank account. I was the trustee of the account because you had to have a secondary signer. But he always had the bank book, and he was extremely proud of it. And he had it for a number of years that I know of. And then on Sunday mornings, he would always give me a phone call every Sunday morning, and he would sing songs that he had recently written. He wrote a song about me that I heard for the first time on this recording about 1986 or so. And then he thought it'd be nice to make a CD, so we got some money together and gave him some money so that he could produce his first CD, which then at Virgin Records in New York later, they had 3 big boxes full of Wesley's music. The Rolling Stones only had 2.5. So Wesley was a success at the Times Square store, and I mentioned that to the manager there. And in conclusion, 2 other things. Wesley always drew with Bic pens. He always had 2 pens. One was a straight edge, and one was the outline of what he drew. And he always worked the drawings from left to right. So he would start over here and finish down here. It always worked out. And he would always look at his drawings at sort of a cockeyed angle. And I mentioned this to Misha Zaks, who was a great psychiatrist in Chicago, husband of Sonia Zaks, the art dealer. And Misha met with Wesley and studied him a little bit, got him to draw some pictures, showed him a phone book, and Wesley looked at the phone book at an angle like this and could recall every single phone number that he saw instantly like that. And Misha said, well, he's got all the characteristics of an idiot savant, which is a person who's a genius but can't express himself, roughly. And so Wesley fell into that category, and other people started talking to him about what he did, and that's how he could remember all the numbers. But he came over one Thanksgiving in 1986 or 7, and he came an hour and a half before the guests showed up that I had prepared. I had mentioned sort of my mistake that I was doing this thing, this reception. And Wesley came down and wanted to eat some turkey, so he ate the whole turkey. And he ate the stuffing. And he ate everything. And so when the 12 people came that I had invited, we catered suddenly. But Wesley was there and regaled them with his stories and so forth. And so the drawings of Wesley's were this autodidactic genius. He often worked off of postcards too, so that the aerial views, some of them are from postcards. And I bought him postcards, and I still have a few of those postcards. I've shown them to a few people. So he remembered everything though. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Rolfe. You don't know how many field trip groups we get that ask, how did Wesley draw from that perspective? So that tidbit of the postcards is very useful for future field trip knowledge. Next, please join me in welcoming Intuit staff member Jane Castro, who will be sharing memories of Henry Darger on behalf of Betsy Fuchs, who is Henry's down-the-hall neighbor. Betsy could not be here this evening. Jane will be sharing on her behalf.
Henry Darger, My Down-the-Hall Neighbor by Betsy Fuchs. Henry Darger was a legacy tenant. He moved to 851 Webster in the 1930s when it was a rooming house. I lived there with my ex-husband, David Berglund, and Henry was my down-the-hall neighbor from March 1969 until November 1972, a few months before his death. We didn't know Henry was an artist, nor did his landlord or landlady, Nathan and Kyoko Lerner, nor did any of the other tenants in the building. Henry's work was discovered after he died. David and I lived in a 3-room apartment at the north end of our shared hallway. Henry lived at the south end, in one large room with a closet containing a sink, but no toilet. All 3 of us shared a hallway bathroom. David and I were hippie wannabes. We went camping frequently. We didn't mind sharing the bathroom. It was an unconventional arrangement, but we wanted to be an unconventional couple. Because Henry had his own sink, he must have washed up in his own room. To the best of our knowledge, he didn't take baths or showers, so we rarely had to negotiate who would use the bathroom at any given time. However, one time when Henry was sick and very frail, before he had to be moved to the nursing home where he died, Dave did give him a bath. While Dave bathed Henry, I took his clothes and bed sheets to the laundromat. His clothes had layers of dirt on them, and the bed sheets were gray from grounding dirt. The primitive tent camper in me was able to handle the grime, though his clothes were much dirtier than the clothes after return from a week of camping. During this time, I brought Henry breakfast of toast and coffee. Daily, I crossed the room to get to his bed, past piles of papers, magazines, and unidentifiable clutter. Piled high on the big oval table in the center of the room, stuffed into cabinets and bookcases, lying on the floor and in the closet. The walls were dingy gray, the piles were dusty and disorganized and looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Henry's door was often open partway. Before Henry got sick and we got personally involved with him, we sometimes peeked in. We were put off by the stuff piled up and the dirt we didn't want to trespass. Once, I heard a conversation between 2 distinct voices, presumably both coming from Henry's room. One high-pitched and childlike, which seemed contrite in response to the other voice, which was strong and aggressive and seemed to be scolding the child voice. Henry came into our apartment only one time, for Christmas dinner. A few days before the dinner, Henry sent a Valentine card addressed to Mr. David, with a handwritten note. For Christmas presents, I would like what I need the most: ivory soap, shaving cream, and something to eat Christmas afternoon. Chicken, no turkey, I hate it. Henry showed up on time. He didn't join in our conversation, ate quickly, and just as quickly left. He went back to his room. I hope we didn't serve turkey. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Betsy. Next, we will welcome another Intuit staff member, Claire Fosnot, to the podium, who will be sharing a story about Mr. Imagination on behalf of John Kane, who could not be here this evening. Claire?
Shake and Bake by John Kane. There is only one of the artists in the exhibition whom I actually knew and could call a friend, and that was Mr. Imagination. Mr. Dawson died just prior to my becoming aware of his art, and other than 2 brief encounters on Randolph Street when a very odd homeless lady in a fake fur jacket and nightgown hustled me to look at her art, experiences that I found terrifying at the time, I had no direct contact with any of the others. But through purchasing some of his art from Carl Hammer, I did know Mr. I. Also through Carl Hammer, I had the opportunity to meet a woman who worked at the Joyce Foundation, who beat me to the punch on purchasing one of Mr. I's pieces that involved a toilet plunger. Through our mutual admiration for him, she helped us receive a small grant from the Joyce Foundation in 1996 that enabled us to bring Mr. Imagination out to Indiana to do workshops in area schools that following winter. He stayed with our exhibits director and her husband, making many new friends at local bars. One night, he came to my house for dinner. Older men are bonded by their vices, I like to say, and Mr. Imagination and I shared an ardent attraction to good-looking young men, of which I kept an abundant supply in my acquaintance. I invited them all over for dinner that night, and Mr. I was happy as a lark. Although I don't cook, a couple of the handsome young men who attended did. It seemed I had little on hand for them to work with, but there was a chicken, and after rooting around in the back of the cupboards, one of them found a very, very old box of Shake and Bake. It had belonged to my dear departed mother, who couldn't cook either, so naturally it meant a lot to me. The attractive cooks were in despair as we bravely opened the box and didn't find anything crawling around. Mr. I was ecstatic. Quote, shake and bake, shake and bake, shake and bake, he sing-songed. Quote, and I helped, unquote, just like an old TV commercial. We all worried what might befall us from eating that chicken dinner, but there was plenty of alcohol to go around, so none of us cared. In short, we survived, and sometime after, Mr. I presented me with a piece of art in honor of our happy evening. While it's hard to see the words shake and bake that he printed with magic marker on the figure's bottle cap purse, the inscription on the base is very easy to read. Quote, to John Kane from Mr. Imagination, February 25th, 1997, Shake and Bake.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, John. Please next join me in welcoming David Leonardis to the stage, or podium, not stage, who will share a story about Wesley Willis.
Thank you very much. It's super awesome that this is all happening, and I hope my tough self doesn't start to cry talking about all this Wesley Willis stories, because it's pretty awesome. And then at the end, I'm going to play my Wesley Willis song, which I've been cleared for the 3 minutes. I met Wesley Willis in front of the Chicago Theater in 1989 when I was working as a caterer. I had been collecting art for about a year, and I knew who he was, and it was a smart move to buy one of his drawings. He had drawn the Chicago Theater with the marquee stating the music of Andrew Lloyd Webber. He was working on several drawings at once. I picked one I liked and told him I wanted darker colors to be used. He finished it and brought it to my apartment later that night. A few years later, after opening my gallery in Wicker Park, I became friends with his bandmates in the Wesley Willis fiasco. I got a call from the guitarist and he told me to turn on MTV, and there was Wesley and the Fiasco band. The coolest thing I could do for all of my friends on my 27th birthday party was to have the Wesley Willis Fiasco play live. A song on one of the albums was recorded at the David Leonardis Gallery, which at the time was beyond awesome. I was doing the Outsiders Outside Art Fair in Michigan, and the Wesley Willis Fiasco was having their last live show in Chicago. And I remember driving back after the art fair was done to see it. I remember him ending it with repeating, "The Fiasco Band is no more, the Fiasco Band is no more." It was epic. Everything about Wesley Willis was epic. His size, his voice, his scar on his face, the permanent bruise on his head from head bumping people. He would say to me, "David Leonardis, bump my head and say rah. Bump my head and say roll. David Leonardis, look into my eyes and you know I'm crazy." And then he would want to bump my girlfriend's head. Sometimes he was a bit forceful and I'd have to tell him to go easy. I bought many drawings over the 14 years I knew him. I remember he was charging $35 and I told him I wanted to give him $50. They were big and awesome, more detailed earlier in his art career, but always expressive and colorful. I had another friend who was an art dealer, and I remember trading him some Howard Finsters for a stack of 25 or more very early Wesley drawings. After Wesley passed, I had one dealer who bought almost all of them, and finally even my first drawing of the Chicago Theater. Sometimes as an art dealer, you have to sell the art you don't want to. It's part of the job. There was such an energy about Wesley that he was one of the big energy fires that were consuming Wicker Park in the 90s. These are just some of my experiences with this great man. There were many other cool people that had many other cool experiences with Wesley over his lifetime. That was one of the things that the cool artists were able to do, was to make you feel important in their mighty presence. All right, I got this on my phone. Thank you very much. That was obviously a really proud moment for me to have my own Wesley Willis song. Thank you.
Thank you, David. The Intuit staff listened to that yesterday in the office and thought it was just the coolest, and we're so jealous to have a personal song made for you by this man. That's awesome. I know he was very generous in that regard and made lots of songs for his friends. That was awesome. Thank you. Next, we will be hearing from, once again, from Intuit's Executive Director, Deb Carr, who will be sharing a story about Lee Godie on behalf of Tim Samuelson, who could not be here this evening. Thank you, Deb.
Thanks, Melissa. I know there's at least one other person in the room who had a Wesley Willis song. Oh, Rolfe, you too, right? If you had, okay, hold up your hands. If you had two of them, like, let's see. Okay, we had some. Okay, and Ricky's got his hand up too. Good. Okay. Okay. All right. Cool. All right. This is about Lee Godie. There are many people who spent time with Ms. Godie, spent more time with Ms. Godie than I did. I've heard many stories of her being difficult with people on the street, and I sometimes witnessed others being subjected to off-putting responses when I was with her. But as far as we were concerned, she was my buddy whenever we encountered each other on the street. I have lots of stories, and all were part of the moment encounters. I was in my teens, 20s, and 30s, and she always warmly remembered and greeted me in our chance street encounters. One day, I found one of her shopping bags filled with rolled paintings and a cascading fur boa sitting unattended at the corner of Columbus Drive and Monroe Street outside the School of the Art Institute. I couldn't see her anywhere around, but was reluctant to move it. So I undertook a search of the area and finally found her at the corner of Randolph and Michigan. Telling her of the unattended shopping bag, she exclaimed excitedly, "Run, run, go get it!" I did as directed and could hear her voice shouting, "Run, run, you will be rewarded," as I ran. Fortunately, the bag was still there, and I ran back to return it to her. She pulled a rolled painting out of the bag, held it horizontally cradled between her hands, and bowed as if presenting a ceremonial sword. "Your reward and my thanks, kind sir," she said as she bowed. It was one of her paintings of multiple hands on a piano keyboard. I asked her why all the watches on the wrists showed different times. She leaned in close and almost whispered, "That's why people find my work so interesting." I offered to pay for the painting, but she gave me a momentary glare that told me to just graciously accept it and give thanks. Because one of my personal topics of research was the work of the architectural partnership of Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan, I once asked Ms. Godie if she would consider painting their portrait. She said she would if I could give her pictures of them the next time I saw her. A few weeks later, I saw her standing by the Michigan Avenue Bridge House at the Wrigley Building, holding a long triple portrait painting beneath her nose. I wanted to buy the painting and ask if she could wait there as I ran back to my office to get some money, and to also bring her the images of Adler and Sullivan. Returning, I purchased the painting and shared the images of the architects with her. She went into a long dialogue, which was like flowing, interconnected sentences without periods, a ribbon of thoughts. Well, I could draw those portraits of dead architects, but I don't know if drawing portraits of dead architects would be the most productive use of time, since there were people long ago in China called the Huntsmans who knew the secret of how to live for over 150 years, which is information that is much more worth spending time on rather than drawing portraits of dead architects, but they won't let me into the public library to study about the Huntsmans. Would you go there, look it up, the information for me? I did say that correctly. Okay. She said she would make the Adler and Sullivan portrait as thanks for my efforts. And when I asked where I could meet up to give her my research results and get the painting, she said, simply do it next time I saw her. I did considerable research at the library without finding anything close to the way she described the Huntsmans, but found some topics that could relate. I didn't see her for quite a while afterwards, and she didn't seem to recall her research request or the Adler and Sullivan portraits when we eventually met. I didn't press the issue. For all I know, somebody may have a Lee Godie portrait of Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler. My warmest recollection of Lee Godie was the time she invited me to join her for lunch. She requested that we picnic at a favorite spot, a small wedge-shaped traffic island containing a Laredo Taft bronze sculpture which stood at Wabash Avenue and Wacker Drive. It was a busy and noisy intersection with cars, horns, and exhaust all around, but the granite base of the sculpture provided a place to sit. She pulled a well-used tea bag out of one of her shopping bags and asked me to go to the Little Corporal restaurant across the street to get 2 cups of hot water for our meal. When I returned with the hot water, she had laid out our lunch, which consisted of neatly placed rows of Oreo cookies. The cream filling had somehow disappeared and was replaced by pieces of chicken. I don't think I'll ever repeat the recipe, but it was the most wonderful lunch I've ever had. Thank you, Tim Samuelson.
Thank you, Deb, and yes, thank you, Tim, for sharing your story. Please next welcome to the podium Bob Alter, who will be sharing a story about Wesley Willis on behalf of Paul Young, who could not be here this evening. Bob?
First encounter with Wesley Willis and his Chicago. This story begins on a cold November morning on Cermak Road in Chicago's Chinatown, 1981. Walking to meet friends for lunch, I saw a tall young man standing across the street. Silhouetted by a panoramic skyline, he was holding a large piece of cardboard propped on his shoe. Being a young architect and a teacher, I could easily discern the large drawing of buildings. I was attracted like a magnet to the site and crossed the street to introduce myself to Wesley Willis. The large drawing in pencil and ink was an aerial view of the loop centered on the Chicago Civic Center, City Hall, and the county building. It was filled with activity, cars, buses, trucks, and more than 1,000 pedestrians. I counted them. Clouds and birds filled the sky. Beautiful. Wesley kindly sold me this drawing for $40. I learned that Wesley lived at Stateway Gardens, 3739 South Federal Street, so he was invited to my first year architecture studio at IIT 3 blocks away, where I had been teaching for many years. When Wesley appeared in Crown Hall, he was given a table of his own. Most of my students were about the same age as Wesley and wanted to become architects as he did. He heard many of my lectures and perused books regularly brought into class on architects, designers, and artists. He was also able to sell his drawings to students and faculty who were shocked and amazed at the talent shown. His mother was proud of his ambition and growing ability to bring money into the household. Being a people person with a sensitive heart and soul, the always observant Wesley was quite comfortable among his peers. Importantly, Wesley received much positive attention from faculty and students alike, which nurtured his self-esteem. Wesley drew almost exclusively in blue pen because architects make blueprints. Using his ballpoint pen, he would typically use the edge of a 12-inch ruler or another pen to draw straight lines. With some nudging, Wesley began to sign and date his drawings. I discouraged the use of felt markers, but failed, in spite of repeatedly providing sets of Prismacolor and graphite pencils. The task of sharpening the pencils slowed him down. He said, "Pencil smudges, drawings, makes you start over." The open plan of Mies van der Rohe's magnificent SR Crown Hall allowed Wesley to see the ongoing work of the 5 undergraduate levels and graduate student work. Freehand sketches, drawings, building models, and models of entire cities. And there were exhibitions I happened to curate which broadened his exposure to architecture and art, ranging from the work of Adler and Sullivan in photos and building artifacts to Sol LeWitt drawings. He loved the fact that at the time of the 1889 auditorium building was built, architect Louis Sullivan's office was on the top floor of the tower, then the tallest building in the city. This building can be seen in a number of Wesley's early works. Wesley was not only inspired by Chicago's buildings, he knew the story count of all of his favorites, but also by the transportation network of the city, the streets, the expressways, and railroads. Through his independent research at public libraries, he gained much. In 1984, he stated, "The library is a working place." There, Wesley would photocopy pictures of buildings, trucks, trains, etc., and often add notes and sketches. He also noted that my drawings are from buildings, photographs, postcards, and books from the library. Writing this story has brought back a flood of memories. Wesley was quite proud to receive an A in drafting class at Harper High School when living in Englewood, and then moved on and on. He was a good Democrat, and we enjoyed talking about local, state, and national politics. So I am thankful to our serendipitous meeting almost 40 years ago. Wesley Willis remains a very special person in my life. And thanks to Paul Young for writing this.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Paul. Next, I will actually be staying up at the podium to share a story about Lee Godie on behalf of Vicky Quoddy, who could not be here this evening. Vicky's story is two bluebirds, Lee Godie, the Prince of Chicago, and a pair of scissors. It was about 1:30 p.m., and I was riding the 151 bus up Michigan Avenue. It was a warm afternoon, and there was only a small breeze. As I got off at Huron, I spotted the street artist Lee Godie wearing a gray dress, long to the knees, with scallops at the hem. It was old, tattered, open at the neck, but still somehow elegant. She's mumbling something inaudible, her head bent down, her arm occasionally flying in the wind. With her other arm, she held a drawing against her dress, a narrow canvas about 4 feet long, 2 bluebirds, repeated 4 times. "I'll sell it to you for $500, she says. As she raises her head, it's hard not to notice the heavy layer of orange rouge covering her cheeks and nose, running under her eyes, almost rimming them. "It shines," she says, turning the canvas back and forth the way a child examines a new toy. "Here, look at it in the sun. The birds are bright blue, and there's a light brown oil sort of washed behind them. The canvas looks as though someone has sprayed sunlight onto it. I saw these bluebirds at Marshall Fields. I sneaked in and copied them quickly. They're very nice. I'll sell you a piece of it for $35, she says, making a cutting motion across the canvas. I tell her I'll buy 2 sets of birds. We settle on 70, but I say I have to run to the gas station across the street to get the money. "What gas station?" she asks. "Listen, honey, why don't you just give me $500 for the whole thing? Doesn't everybody at least make $300 a week these days? What do you do for a living?" I tell her I'm a writer and an editor. She nods her head. "Oh dear, I understand. I was a writer once. I worked 3 telephones for a whole week and they gave me $12. $12 for a week. You don't have $500, I know that." She takes hold of my arm and gives me her advice. "Honey, the only way to make money is to do what your parents do, only better. My parents were painters." I leave her at the corner and run across the street, grabbing the last $100 out of my account. Lee is still on the sidewalk, the canvas up against her dress again, hawking it as I return. She stares at me. You know, a woman once tried to buy one of my pictures and she disappeared just like you did. She said she was getting money, but she came back too soon, and I wouldn't sell to her. The bank doesn't give you money that quick. She lied to me. Oh no, Lee, I say, pointing to the cash machine. See that line of people? They're waiting to get money from the machine. That money gives you machine. It gives them money. That quickly? Sure. Okay, she says. Come in with me and we'll find something to cut it with. They know me in here. We walk into Neiman Marcus and up to the first counter where the salesman looks at Lee as though she is radioactive. I ask for the scissors, knowing I would have a better chance of getting them. Lee cuts the canvas slowly. She turns it over, and the black and white profile of a young man she's labeled the Prince of Chicago is on the back. Lee takes the money. I give her 3 $20 bills and a 10. Before she hands over the painting, she tells me how to hang it. She folds over the top and imitates a stapler with her hand. I've seen these in Marshall Fields. They put up a piece of stick through here and hang it. It's very classy. It's a classy place. I walk her outside and Lee points her finger at me like a cross between an angry aunt and a concerned mother. If you ever need money, she says, I'll buy it back from you. I tell her to put her money away. She is just holding onto it loosely, folded in her palm. Yes, I will, don't worry, she says, walking away. And that is Vicky's story. Thank you, Vicky. And now I would like to welcome Alice Ravelski up to the stage. Alice will share a story about Mr. Imagination.
I brought my audio-visual. I used to be a librarian for a while, so I had to bring some audio-visual. I thought my story was unique, but I looked at the blurb about Mr. Imagination from the exhibit, and I guess he was generous to a lot of people. But it still meant something to me. This is called Sandstone Head. I went on a tour of African American artist studios several years ago. It was more than several. Some of these dates I can, from this blurb, kind of go back in time. There was a woman from the Art Institute that used to organize bus tours around the city, and that's where the tour was from. One of the people whose studio apartment was on the tour was Mr. Imagination. I think that I met him at other events, but I was excited to see him where he lived, because you could see his apartment when you take the red line. It was above, you can still see where it used to be. He's not there anymore, but it was by like a Chinese restaurant below it. I decided to bring along one of the dolls that I create to give him as a gift. And this is one of my dolls that it's been a long time I made these dolls, and they're actually in the Intuit store. It's like a select club, these dolls. A lot of people have these, but it's a select club. So anyway, at the time his brother was still alive, and he was living with Mr. Imagination, and he showed us the frames that he made from the wrappers, like cigarette wrappers or gum, and I bought one from him. I can pass this around. And I read in the blurb that his brother died in 2001, so that's almost 20 years ago. You know, time flies. I didn't remember it was so long ago. When the tour was finished, we were boarding the bus, and this was after I gave him the angel for a gift. And guess who comes running up to me with one of his sandstone sculptures as a gift, but Mr. Imagination. He was indeed a generous soul. It was a wonderful moment, and I treasure the memory, except for some people who were grumbling that his art dealer would not appreciate him giving away his art like that. Several years later, I did a project, and a lot of other people did a project about global warming called Cool Globes. Some of the cool globes traveled to the United States Botanic Garden in Washington, D.C., and I was proud that my globe that faced the Capitol was next to Mr. Imagination's. And I went to Washington for when the globe was there, and I went when they had a tour with people from the Capitol, congressmen, and that. This is my globe, but his was right next to mine, and I remember telling the people from the congressmen and that who were on the tour about Mr. Imagination and his globe. So bless his soul. You're welcome. I'll put this there.
Thanks, Alice. Next, please join me in welcoming Karen Henson up to share memories about Wesley Willis and Lee Godie. Karen?
My encounters with Lee Godie and Wesley Willis. Hi, my name is Karen Henson. Former married name was Katzman at the time of my story. I met both Lee Godie and Wesley Willis when I was simultaneously working at Favorable Art Supply Store and attending classes at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in Chicago, Illinois. Wesley would sit by the front counter at Favorable. Looking out the door, he worked on his street scene drawings. I remember talking with him in between waiting on customers. Lee Godie frequented both places. I would see her in the store and sell her single pastels. She also liked the scraps of mat board and the framing department. She once offered me $5 for a safety pin. Not having one, I asked my coworkers, but we couldn't find one. Lee Godie used to sit on the bench in the painting studio hall at the old SAIC building behind the museum. When I got out of class, she asked me if she could draw me, but I was reluctant to at the time for some reason. Now, years later, I feel privileged to have crossed paths with these two colorful souls, and like I need to release my own art while I'm still alive. They were both excellent at marketing their art in their own ways. I found a large safety pin on the floor when I picked up my old typewriter to do this paper. I couldn't help but laugh and feel the presence of Lee Godie somehow, and I would gladly offer it to her now if I could.
Thank you, Karen. And now, it saddens me to say that we're nearing the end of our storytelling program. But to bring us home, we welcome Intuit staff member Teddy Brazunas up to share a few brief stories. The first about Lee Godie and Mr. Imagination on behalf of Kathy Pila. The second about Lee Godie on behalf of Jill Weinberg. And the third about Lee Godie on behalf of Keith Bringe, all of whom could not be here this evening. Teddy?
So, let's start with the stories from Kathy Pilat. Lee Godie's makeup sponge. I'd heard about Lee Godie and recognized her one day near the water tower at Michigan Avenue in Chicago. I approached her regarding the ballpoint drawing she was working on and asked to buy it. She said it wasn't finished, wasn't painted, but did sell it to me. She then offered to gift me with one of the brand new makeup sponges that she used to apply paint. Knowing that she was destitute and needed her art tools, I declined, but was touched and thanked her warmly. So I was utterly shocked and embarrassed when Lee suddenly spewed a litany of loud and furious cursing as I was stuck waiting to cross the street in the midst of the pedestrians. So this one is about Mr. Imagination, New Trier High School visiting artists. As art department chair at New Trier, I invited Mr. Imagination to present his work at our Saturday visiting artist event. Gregory also did a hands-on workshop with the attending students, and he brought industrial sandstone for them to carve. I remember him as energetic, warm, kind, and happy to be there. I carved 2 pieces of my own, but Gregory gave me a piece he carved of my name and another of the year 2000. So moving on to Jill Weinberg, Rejection by Lee Godie. I spent years walking daily to work from 900 North Lakeshore Drive to 1 South Franklin. Window shopping was always fun. People watching was always interesting, and seeing the street lady with art was a daily bonus. She muttered to passerbys, often swearing and telling us not to look at her. But I always said hi, and she usually looked away. Some days I was by myself walking, other times with my husband. He wasn't nearly as interested in her or her art as I was. I told him many times I really liked her art. He gave the same response to me that she did, complete disinterest in what I was saying. Then one day I said to him, "I'm serious, I really want to buy her art." I asked him to stop with me. I said to the woman, "I walk by you every day and I want to buy your art." She said, "I can't sell to you." I said, "Why not? I love your art. I've been wanting to buy it for years. I want to pay you for it." She said, "I can't sell to you." I said, "Why not?" She said, You are too short." I said, "Can you sell to him?" She said, "Yep, he can buy them." And that is how I became the proud owner of a few pieces of Lee Godie art that I treasure to this day. So last story from Keith Bringy. For a year in 1979, when I was 16 years old, I attended bi-weekly classes in museology at the Art Institute. We had a generous lunch hour, and I would wander in the gardens and find Lee and sit with her. She tried to sell me her work, and I regret not getting her price together, usually $20 to $30. She was usually cranky, and I don't remember a lot of what we talked about, except for one thing she said with passionate emphasis. "Kid, I have one piece of advice. Never pay for materials. It's a racket, those art stores. Just go to dry cleaner and ask for cardboard." That's it. That's my Lee Godie story.
Thank you, Teddy, and thank you, Kathy, Jill, and Keith for your stories. Okay, folks, that concludes our program for the evening. I want to thank you all for attending, and a special thank you to all of you who shared stories with us this evening. But the storytelling need not stop here tonight. We will continue to collect stories on an ongoing basis, so if you or anyone you know has more stories to share, please send them to us through our online form on our website, which is www.art.org, or send them via email to intuit@art.org. We have some future projects on the horizon that we'd like to continue to include these stories in. All submitted stories will be kept on file at Intuit and may be considered for inclusion in future collected stories projects. We want to once again acknowledge our partner, Free Spirit Media, for documenting this program tonight. Video of this program will be shared with the wider public through Intuit's website, through social media, and in all email communications in the coming weeks. A link to the video will also be directly shared with all of you as speakers and attendees this evening. You will know as soon as it's available. And with that, we invite you to stay for a bit and talk amongst yourselves, get to know someone if you had a burning question that you want to ask one of the speakers tonight. The galleries will stay open for the next 30 minutes. There will be beverages in the performance space. So with that, keep the storytelling going, and thank you very much. Have a good night.